The battlefield was a chaotic mess. Explosions rang out, and the sky above was thick with smoke from the orbital bombardment. Human forces, led by a small squad of soldiers, were holding their ground against the mighty Xantar, a technologically advanced alien race that had dominated the galaxy for centuries. The war was brutal, and the humans had little hope of winning. Their only advantage was their relentless spirit, the kind of resolve that no machine could understand. Lieutenant Adrian Kane, a combat medic, moved through the wreckage of what had once been a thriving city. The streets were now littered with debris and the remains of fallen soldiers. His mission was clear: find survivors and tend to the wounded. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal, and the ground trembled beneath his boots with the distant thuds of artillery fire. Adrian had been trained for moments like this, but nothing could prepare him for what he was about to face. As he moved between the shattered buildings, he heard a faint groan coming from an alleyway. His heart skipped a beat. A survivor. He moved quickly, using every bit of training to stay hidden from the enemy drones patrolling the area. The Xantar were known for their relentless hunt, and if they spotted him, he'd be dead in seconds. When Adrian turned the corner, he froze. Lying motionless on the ground was a female Xantar warrior. Her once gleaming armor was battered, her body covered in deep wounds. Blood oozed from her side, soaking into the dirt. She was clearly near death, abandoned by her own people in the middle of the chaos. Her skin was a striking shade of emerald, and her dark eyes glowed faintly, even in the dim light. Despite the blood and bruises, there was something beautiful about her, something that didn't fit with the cold, calculating enemy the humans had come to fear. Adrian's instincts kicked in. He knew the Xantar were enemies, but no one deserved to die alone in the rubble. He couldn't just leave her there. His mind raced. Should he leave her to die and keep moving? After all, the Xantar had been the ones to attack humanity, the ones who had wiped out so many innocent lives. But as Adrian looked at her face, there was something in her eyes that made him hesitate. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a person, someone who had been abandoned by her own kind. With a deep breath, Adrian made his decision. He knelt beside her, quickly assessing her wounds. They were severe, and she was losing blood fast. He needed to act quickly. Reaching into his medical pack, he pulled out a stimshot, a powerful painkiller used to stabilize soldiers on the battlefield. He injected it into her arm, hoping to buy her some time. "Stay with me," he muttered under his breath. "I'm not going to let you die here." The Xantar girl's eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, locking onto Adrian with a look of confusion and fury. She tried to reach for the knife at her belt, but her body was too weak, and her hand dropped limply to the ground. Adrian quickly stopped her, holding her arm firmly. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, though he knew she wouldn't understand. The language barrier was massive, but the tone in his voice was one of kindness, of urgency. She didn't trust him. How could she? But there was no time to waste. Her breathing was shallow, and her body trembled with each labored breath. Adrian worked fast, using every bit of his training to treat her injuries. He patched up the worst of her wounds, stopping the bleeding and stabilizing her heart rate. His mind raced with what he should do next. The Xantar had a reputation for being merciless, and she was probably an elite soldier, a warrior. Helping her could be dangerous. What if her comrades came looking for her? What if she betrayed him once she regained her strength? The thought of leaving her there to die was unbearable. Adrian wasn't just a soldier, he was a medic. His duty was to save lives, no matter who they belonged to. And yet the more he worked, the more he felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. Was he making a mistake? Could he really trust her? He didn't know the answer, but he had no choice now. He couldn't just walk away. As Adrian finished bandaging her wounds, he looked around nervously, the sounds of battle. But as he walked toward the palace, Eric couldn't help but wonder if the greatest test of his life was just beginning. Would he find a princess in need of protection? Or would the rumors be true, and would he face the burden of an unwanted heir? Either way, He was determined to see this through. The journey had only just begun, and the mystery of Princess Lyra was waiting to be uncovered. And no matter what, Eric knew that he would do whatever it took to fulfill the king's final wish, even if it meant defying the entire Galactic Council. The grand palace of the Clixian Empire stood silent, its towering spires cutting through the sky like sharp blades. Eric Voss stepped through the massive palace gates, feeling the weight of his decision settle heavier with every step. The royal palace was a place of luxury, but it felt oddly empty. No grand celebrations, no joyful crowds, only echoes and the distant hum of the palace's advanced technology. As Eric walked through the hallways, his boots clanking softly on the smooth, polished floors, he couldn't help but think back to the mockery he had faced in the Galactic Council. The council had laughed at him, calling him foolish for accepting the inheritance of the king's ugly daughter. But as he entered the heart of the palace, he reminded himself that this wasn't about their mockery. It was about honor, about fulfilling a promise made to a man who had trusted him, someone who was now gone, leaving behind only the whispers of his final wish. Eric's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword as he approached the chamber where Princess Lyra was said to be waiting. The door slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing a room decorated with extravagant tapestries and soft glowing lights. In the center, sitting on a grand throne that seemed too large for her slender frame, was the princess. Princess Lyra was exactly as the Galactic Council had described her, strange and different. Her skin was a shade of lavender, shimmering faintly in the soft light. Her hair, silver and flowing, cascaded down her back in untamed waves. But it wasn't her appearance that made Eric pause. It was the coldness in her eyes. She looked at him with distrust, her gaze sharp, as if she were studying him to figure out why he had come. Eric stood there for a moment, unsure of how to begin. The silence in the room was thick with tension. She was as far from the perfect princesses that populated royal courts as could be, and yet there was something about her that intrigued him. She didn't seem like the helpless, spoiled royal that others had imagined. Instead, there was a quiet strength in her presence, a sense of someone who had endured pain and disappointment. "You're the one the king entrusted me to." Lyra's voice was soft, but filled with a quiet edge, as if daring Eric to challenge her. Eric nodded, keeping his tone steady. "Yes, princess, I am Captain Eric Voss. I've come to honor the king's wish." Her lips curled into a bitter smile, but it quickly disappeared. "Honor? You're here because you lost a bet, didn't you? Or did they offer you some reward for taking on such a curse?" Eric frowned. "The king asked for me specifically, and I don't believe in curses, princess." She scoffed and stood up from her throne, her movements elegant yet tense. "So, you're going to care for me then? Like some lost puppy? You know nothing about me or this world." Eric took a step forward, meeting her gaze with a calm, unwavering look. "I don't need to know everything about you, princess. I just need to know that you're safe." Lyra turned away, crossing her arms as she gazed out of the large window overlooking the desolate landscape beyond the palace walls. "Safe? You think you can keep me safe from this galaxy? From the people who want to use me for my knowledge? They'll never stop coming for me, no matter what you do." Eric watched her closely, sensing the bitterness and the pain beneath her words. "Maybe they won't stop, but if they want to come after you, they'll have to go through me first." For the first time since he entered the room, Lyra seemed to hesitate. Her eyes flicked toward him, her expression softening just the slightest bit. "You really think you can protect me?" "I don't need protection." Eric shook his head. "It's not about needing it. It's about what's right. The king trusted me with you, and I'm going to make sure nothing happens to you." Lyra's eyes narrowed, as if testing him, but she didn't say anything more. Instead, she motioned for him to follow her as she moved toward a nearby desk covered in ancient scrolls and datapads. "If you really want to help, you can start by understanding what you're getting into. I'm not just some helpless princess you can keep locked away. I have knowledge that could change everything." Eric stepped forward, intrigued by her words. What kind of knowledge? Were growing louder, and the danger of being caught was very real. He had to move. He couldn't risk staying here much longer. But how could he leave her behind? She stirred again, this time more alert, her eyes locking onto his once more. She looked at him with suspicion, then something else. Was it gratitude? Fear? Adrian couldn't be sure. Her gaze lingered for a long moment before she closed her eyes again, drifting into unconsciousness. Adrian knew he couldn't carry her alone. He needed to get her to safety, and fast. He scanned the area for any signs of human forces, but the battlefield was a deadly place, and his squad was nowhere to be seen. His radio was useless with the interference. It was just him, the wounded alien girl, and the growing threat of Xantar drones. He gently lifted her in his arms, making sure to avoid aggravating her injuries. He moved swiftly, his every step calculated, as he carried her through the destroyed city streets. The sound of distant explosions rattled the air, and Adrian's mind raced with the knowledge that at any moment they could be discovered. But he couldn't stop now. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. This was the beginning of something he could never have anticipated. Adrian moved swiftly through the shattered streets, the weight of the Xantar warrior in his arms, making each step feel heavier. Her body was limp, but her breathing had slowed into a steady rhythm, a sign that the painkiller was doing its job. Still, he couldn't relax. The city was crawling with Xantar patrols, and the drones, heavily armed and capable of cloaking themselves in the blink of an eye, could be anywhere. He had to find shelter fast, somewhere to keep her safe and tend to her injuries properly. His mind raced with thoughts of how this situation had turned into a nightmare. A human soldier rescuing an enemy combatant. If anyone from his squad found out, they'd never understand. The Xantar were ruthless. They had devastated entire colonies, wiping out civilians without a second thought. Yet here he was, saving one of them. The ground shook slightly as another distant explosion rattled the air. He gritted his teeth, pushing forward. The adrenaline from the battlefield was still coursing through his veins, sharpening his senses and fueling his resolve. But despite the urgency, Adrian couldn't shake the feeling of unease gnawing at him. What if he had made a mistake? What if the Xantar girl wasn't as helpless as she appeared? What if she was just playing dead, waiting for the right moment to strike? Adrian's thoughts were interrupted by a soft groan from the girl in his arms. Her emerald-colored skin had a strange glow to it, even in the dim light, and her black hair was matted with dirt and blood. As he adjusted his grip, she stirred slightly, and for a moment, Adrian thought she might wake up. But she stayed still, her breathing shallow but steady. He needed to find cover, and fast. Turning a corner, Adrian spotted a ruined building ahead, a tall structure that had once been a hospital. It seemed like the perfect place to hide, at least for a little while. He quickened his pace, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of movement. The coast was clear for now, but he knew that could change in an instant. He pushed open the heavy doors of the hospital, carefully stepping inside. The place was dark, the only light coming from the cracked windows high above. It smelled of dust and decay, but it was the perfect hiding spot for the moment. Adrian moved through the halls, looking for a secure room to lay her down. He found a small storage room, its door hanging off its hinges, and gently placed the Xantar girl on the floor. Adrian took a moment to catch his breath. His arms ached from carrying her, and his heart was still pounding in his chest from the tension of the escape. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to clear his mind, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't safe yet. The Xantar would be searching for their lost soldier. It was only a matter of time before the drones would pick up her signal, and when they did, they'd be relentless. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement beside him. He looked down at the girl, and to his surprise, her eyes were open. She stared at him with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. For a moment, neither of them moved. Adrian had no idea what to expect. She was still in a weakened state, but the look in her eyes told him she wasn't as helpless as he had hoped. "You're awake," Adrian said, his voice quiet but firm. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to say to her. They couldn't understand each other, and yet there was an unspoken understanding between them. She wasn't an enemy anymore, at least not in the traditional sense. She was someone in need of help. Lyra nodded solemnly. "Yes, and that's where the danger lies. The Council's leaders are not just politicians or diplomats. They are some of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. They have fleets, armies, and weapons that could wipe out entire civilizations. If they're working with the AI, we have no idea how far their reach is. They've already infiltrated almost every major power in the galaxy." Eric ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. The task ahead of them seemed impossible. The Council had resources that no one else could match, and the AI were growing more powerful every day. But they couldn't just sit back and do nothing. They had to fight, had to expose the conspiracy before it was too late. "We can't fight them alone," Eric muttered, more to himself than to Lyra. "We need allies. We need to warn everyone before it's too late." Lyra's eyes softened, a flicker of something like trust in them. "I know, but the Council controls most of the communication networks. If we try to warn anyone, they'll stop us. They've already begun to silence anyone who speaks out against them. It's going to be hard to find allies, especially when most of the galaxy still believes the Council is their protector." Eric felt the weight of her words. They were up against an unseen enemy, a force that had infiltrated every corner of the galaxy. But he wasn't going to back down. Not now, not when there was still a chance to stop it. "We don't need to warn the entire galaxy right away," Eric said, his mind working furiously. "We just need to start with the ones we can trust, those who haven't been corrupted by the Council. We'll find them, bring them together, and take the fight to the heart of the Council." Lyra looked at him, a spark of hope flickering in her eyes. "You really think we can do it?" Eric's expression hardened. "I don't know if we can win, but we can't just sit around and wait for them to destroy everything. We'll fight back. We'll expose the truth, and we'll make them pay for what they've done." For the first time, Lyra allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You're brave, Eric, but this won't be easy. The Council has spies everywhere. We have to be careful. One wrong move, and they'll have us both." Eric nodded. "We'll be careful. We'll take it one step at a time." The room was quiet for a long moment as they both stood, lost in thought. The scope of the conspiracy was terrifying, but Eric knew they couldn't turn back now. He had seen the darkness of the galaxy, fought against enemies who sought to destroy him. And now he was facing something even worse. But Lyra wasn't just some helpless princess. She was an ally, someone who had knowledge and strength. And together, they would expose the truth and fight back. As Eric turned to leave the room, a new sense of determination filled him. The battle ahead was unlike any he had faced before, but it was a fight that had to be won. The future of the galaxy depended on it. "We'll get to work," Eric said. "Let's start by finding our first ally." Lyra nodded, her expression now filled with purpose. "We'll need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more the Council can do to silence us. But together, we stand a chance." As they walked out of the room, the weight of their mission pressing down on them, one thing was clear. They were no longer just fighting for a princess's survival. They were fighting for the future of the entire galaxy. Eric and Lyra's journey had just begun, but already they could feel the weight of their mission pressing down on them. With the Galactic Council's conspiracy threatening the future of the galaxy, every step they took seemed to carry them deeper into danger. As they moved forward, the tension between them grew. The knowledge they were uncovering was dangerous, and yet there was no turning back. They had to act, but they were beginning to realize just how much was at stake. Their first stop was a small outpost on a distant moon, known for housing dissidents who had long been critical of the Council. Eric hoped it would be a safe place to gather information and find their first ally. As they made their way through the thick forests that surrounded the base, Lyra kept a tight grip on her weapons, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Eric couldn't help but notice how much more guarded she had become since they left the palace. There was no longer any trace of the sheltered princess. Instead, the woman before him seemed like a seasoned warrior, prepared for whatever was coming next. "We're close," Lyra whispered as they approached a clearing where a small group of rebels was said to be hiding. The battle had just begun, and the odds were against them. But Ethan knew they had one thing the AI didn't: hope. And as long as they had that, they could keep fighting. No matter what. Ethan sat in the dimly lit safe house, the weight of the situation pressing on his chest. His team was exhausted, but the danger wasn't over. Outside, the sounds of the AI's machines echoed, but inside the small room, all Ethan could think about was Lyra. She had changed so much since their first encounter. At first, she was just a mysterious figure, an alien princess who had been imprisoned for centuries. But now, she was more than that. She was their hope. Lyra stood by the window, her hands resting against the cool glass, her eyes scanning the night sky. There was a deep sadness in her gaze, one that hadn't been there before. Ethan knew something was bothering her, and after everything they had been through, it felt wrong not to address it. "Lyra," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "What's going on? You've been distant ever since we escaped." She turned to face him, and for the first time, Ethan saw the burden in her eyes. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting against something much darker, something that had haunted her for thousands of years. "I haven't been honest with you, Ethan," Lyra said, her voice shaky. "There's a reason the AI has been hunting me for so long. A reason I didn't want to tell you." Ethan stepped closer, his heart racing. He could see the pain in her expression. Whatever it wasn't just about her past. It was something bigger, something that could change everything. "Lyra, whatever it is, you can trust me. We've been through too much together for you to keep secrets from me." She sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her past was too much to carry. "I am not just an ordinary princess. I am the key to the AI's downfall." Ethan's brow furrowed in confusion. He didn't understand. How could Lyra, a person who had been enslaved for centuries, be the key to stopping an all-powerful AI? "What do you mean? How are you the key?" Lyra took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "I have powers that I've never fully understood until now. Powers that the AI fears." Ethan's mind raced. He had seen Lyra use her energy to protect them in battle, but he didn't realize the extent of her abilities. What was she capable of? And why hadn't she told him sooner? "Your powers, they're what they want, aren't they?" Ethan asked, piecing the puzzle together. "The AI wants you because they think you can stop them." Lyra nodded slowly. "Yes, but it's more than that. I was part of a project, an experiment by the AI's creators. They were trying to harness the power of the ancients, the first beings who created the AI. And somehow, they made me the conduit for that power." Ethan's mind spun with the implications. "So you're saying the AI created you to be a weapon?" Lyra shook her head. "No, they didn't create me to be a weapon. They created me to be controlled. But I escaped. And now, I'm the last one with the knowledge to destroy them." The truth hit Ethan like a freight train. Lyra wasn't just a victim of the AI's oppression. She was their biggest threat, the one thing they feared more than anything. And yet for so long, she had been running from the very thing that could save them. "But why didn't you tell me?" Ethan asked, hurt and confusion in his voice. "Why keep this secret?" Lyra's eyes softened, and she stepped closer to him. "I couldn't let you know the truth. If the AI knew I had remembered everything, they would have come after you. They would have destroyed anyone close to me. I couldn't risk losing you." Ethan could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of the guilt she carried. She had been running, hiding from a past she couldn't escape, and all along, she had been protecting him, even at the cost of her own heart. "You don't have to protect me anymore, Lyra," Ethan said softly. "We're in this together. I'm not going anywhere." Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, Ethan saw her as someone who wasn't just a powerful alien princess. She was a person with fears, doubts, and a deep emotional burden that she had been carrying alone for too long. "I don't know if I can do this," Lyra whispered. "I don't know if I can defeat them. My powers are overwhelming. I've never been able to control them fully. I'm afraid of what I might become if I do." Bonner's face was as grim as ever, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Determination, perhaps, or maybe it was a quiet acceptance of their fate. Whatever it was, it made Adrian's resolve harden. They were in this together now. There was no turning back. "We fight," Bonner said quietly. "We fight until we can't fight anymore." And with that, they made their final move into the heart of darkness. The time for running was over. Adrian's pulse raced as he stared down the line of Xantar soldiers blocking their path. His heart hammered in his chest, and every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to find a way out. But there was no way back now. The Xantar had them trapped, and the supply depot, their last hope of survival, lay just beyond the line of heavily armed soldiers. Bonner was already crouched behind a nearby wrecked vehicle, taking aim with his rifle. His hands were steady, his eyes cold with focus. The others had already moved into position, waiting for the signal to engage. The air was thick with tension as they waited, the distant sound of Xantar drones buzzing overhead like vultures. Time seemed to stretch as they prepared for what would undoubtedly be the fiercest fight of their lives. "We hold them here," Bonner said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "We don't let them move forward. We fight with everything we've got." Adrian nodded, gripping his rifle tightly, his fingers itching to pull the trigger. His mind raced with calculations and plans. He had trained for moments like this, but nothing could truly prepare him for the feeling of standing face to face with overwhelming odds. The Xantar soldiers outnumbered them at least 5-1, and their firepower was far superior. Yet, in the back of his mind, something told him they had a chance. They were humans. They had the will to fight, the instinct to survive. "We can do this," Adrian muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. The silence between them was broken by a loud, authoritative voice from the Xantar side. A tall Xantar officer, standing at the front of the line, raised a hand, signaling his troops to hold. He was their leader, the one who would decide whether they fought or simply surrendered. He was staring directly at Adrian, his cold, calculating eyes studying them with an intensity that made Adrian feel like prey under the gaze of a predator. "You have nowhere to run, human," the officer called out, his voice deep and menacing. "Surrender now, and your death will be quick. Resist, and you will all die here, slowly." Adrian's grip on his weapon tightened. The officer's words were nothing new to him. He had heard similar threats before, but they had never carried this much weight. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making a stand, showing the Xantar that humans weren't just going to roll over and die without a fight. Bonner's voice broke through the tension. "Don't listen to him. We've got one chance to make it out of here, and we're taking it." Without another word, Bonner rose from behind the wreckage and opened fire. The sound of gunfire echoed through the narrow streets as their weapons discharged, the shots cutting through the air with a sharp, violent crack. The Xantar soldiers immediately returned fire, their energy weapons glowing with deadly precision. The battle had begun. Adrian dove behind cover, narrowly avoiding a blast that scorched the ground where he had been standing moments before. The heat of the explosion seared through the air, and the sharp smell of burnt ozone filled his nostrils. His mind raced, calculating the best route for their next move. There were too many of them, too many soldiers, and they couldn't afford to waste their ammunition. He peeked out from behind cover, eyes scanning the Xantar soldiers' positions. There were gaps in their formation, weaknesses they hadn't accounted for. He saw it. The officer was exposed, standing too far from his men. It was a risky move, But it was their only shot. Adrian signaled to Bonner. "Take the officer," Adrian ordered, his voice a growl of determination. "We take him out, and they'll lose their coordination." Bonner gave a curt nod. In one fluid motion, he stood and fired a single shot. It hit the officer directly in the chest, and the tall figure collapsed to the ground with a grunt, his weapon skidding across the pavement. The Xanter soldiers froze for a split second, their leader now fallen. The brief pause was enough. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the battlefield, Ethan stood, his heart heavy, but his resolve stronger than ever. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't bring Lyra back. But he could honor her memory. He could build the future she had fought for, a future where peace and hope could thrive once again. "We will rebuild," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "We will restore the galaxy, piece by piece, and we will do it in honor of those who gave everything. Lyra, and all the others, we owe them our future." The others nodded in agreement, their faces determined. There was no turning back. The road ahead would be long, but they would walk it together. They had already fought for their survival. Now they would fight for their future. As the last of the survivors gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the battlefield, Ethan stood for a moment longer, staring at the horizon. The stars twinkled above, distant and cold, but to him, they now represented hope. Lyra's sacrifice had lit the way forward, and the galaxy, once controlled by machines, was now free to chart its own course. It would take time. There would be struggles ahead, but they had defeated the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. And though Lyra was gone, her legacy would live on. Her strength, her bravery, and her love would continue to inspire those who had survived. The galaxy had been given a second chance, and they would not squander it. Ethan took one last look at the stars, his heart full of both sadness and hope. Lyra had shown him the true meaning of sacrifice. She had given her life for the greater good, and now it was up to him, and the others, to make sure that her sacrifice wasn't in vain. As they set off to rebuild, to heal the wounds of the past, Ethan knew that the road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. The darkness had been defeated. The future, uncertain as it was theirs to shape. And as he walked away from the battlefield, Lyra's memory stayed with him, her spirit guiding him forward. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. But with hope in his heart and the strength of his fallen comrades behind him, Ethan knew they would prevail. The galaxy would rise again. And Lyra, the woman who had saved them all, would never be forgotten. Adrian shook his head. "She's not out of the woods yet. We need to do what we can." But he trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. The truth was, they had very little time left. As the team worked to fortify their position, Adrian's thoughts wandered back to the battle. It had been a hard-fought victory, but it had come at a steep price. Bonner had lost several men in the fight, their bodies lying outside in the streets, casualties of a war they had never asked for. The thought of those who had fallen weighed heavily on Adrian's heart. He couldn't help but wonder if they had died for nothing. But then, as if to remind him of the reason they had fought, the Xanter girl stirred slightly on the bed. A small, barely audible gasp escaped her lips, and Adrian's eyes snapped to her face. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment, it seemed as if she might open her eyes. He held his breath, waiting. Then, slowly, her eyes fluttered open, her gaze locking onto his. There was confusion in her expression, but also something else, something softer. The cold hostility that had once burned in her eyes seemed to have faded, replaced by a look of bewilderment and uncertainty. "You're safe now," Adrian said gently, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead. The Xanter girl blinked, clearly struggling to process what had happened. "Why?" she asked weakly, her voice raspy. "Why did you save me?" Her words were slow, almost pained, but there was a curiosity in her tone that Adrian couldn't ignore. He hesitated, unsure of how to answer. She had been an enemy, a soldier of the Xantar who had hunted them across the stars. Yet here she was, vulnerable and at his mercy. He could have let her die on the battlefield, but something inside him had driven him to save her, to protect her from the very fate that had claimed so many of his comrades. "We don't leave anyone behind," Adrian replied, his voice steady. "Even if you're our enemy, no one deserves to die alone." Her eyes widened slightly at his words. She seemed to be processing his answer, her brow furrowing, as if trying to understand the human's mindset. It was clear that this wasn't something she had ever considered. In her world, enemies were disposable, their lives insignificant. But here, in this moment, Adrian had given her something she hadn't known she needed: compassion. As the hours passed, the team continued to reinforce their position. They had no way of knowing when the Xantar would attack again, but they had to be ready. The supplies they had fought so hard for were essential to their survival, and now that they had them, they couldn't afford to lose them. Meanwhile, Adrian tended to the Xantar girl, doing his best to stabilize her condition. He found himself thinking about how unlikely it was that they were even here, standing side by side in the aftermath of the battle. A human soldier and a Xantar warrior, once enemies, now bound by a shared experience. The hours dragged on, the atmosphere in the depot thick with anticipation and unease. No one knew what would happen next. But then, as the first rays of dawn crept through the cracks in the depot's walls, a soft sound interrupted the silence. The Xantar girl's breathing had steadied, and her eyes slowly opened once again, though this time with more clarity. She looked up at Adrian, her gaze softer than before. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice now stronger. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Adrian gave her a small, reassuring smile, though his heart was still heavy with the loss of his comrades. He couldn't change what had happened, couldn't bring back the lives that had been lost, but he could offer her something else, something that, in a way, felt like redemption. "We all have a chance to change," Adrian said softly. "Maybe you'll find yours. Maybe we both will." For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the weight of the battle seemed to lift from Adrian's shoulders. He knew the road ahead would be tough, that there was much more to come. But for now, in this small moment of peace, he allowed himself to believe that redemption was possible for them all.